Hello, this is the Global News podcast from the BBC World Service, with reports and analysis from across the world. The latest news 7 days a week. BBC World Service podcasts are supported by advertising.
This is the Global News podcast from the BBC World Service. I'm Alex Ritson, and at a little after 13 hours GMT on Monday the 24th of October, these are our main stories. Rishi Sunak is set to become the UK's third Prime Minister in 2 months. Warning shots have been fired by both North and South Korea after a North Korean merchant ship crossed into South Korean waters. As Ukrainian troops retake territory in the Kherson region, we hear from those returning to liberated villages there.
We
lived here with my husband for 15 years with 3 children. But when we came here after liberation, it was horror, tears, pain, frustration.
Also in this podcast, Uganda attempts to contain an outbreak of the Ebola virus, and
the only way these women are going to go on the record is if they all jump together.
Eventually, they did.
A film about the original Harvey Weinstein case is to be released in the coming weeks as the disgraced Hollywood producer faces trial once again. We're recording this podcast a little later than normal as we've been waiting to hear who the next Prime Minister here in the UK will be. There were 3 candidates to succeed Liz Truss as leader of the governing Conservative Party and therefore as Prime Minister in the next day or so. They sought support from Conservative members of Parliament. 100 nominations were needed to be a valid candidate. Sir Graham Brady, who chairs the committee which represents Conservative MPs, made the key announcement a few minutes before we recorded this podcast.
Good afternoon. As returning officer in the leadership election, I can confirm that we have received 1 valid nomination.
Our political correspondent Rob Watson spoke afterwards to James Menendez.
Well, what a hugely historic moment for the United Kingdom, because before we move on to the politics of this, it is worth pausing, since the sort of role of a British Prime Minister was created in the 18th century. This is absolutely the first time. There have been women before, but this is the first British Asian Prime Minister. And I do think that is a hugely important milestone for this country, because it is confirmation, if confirmation were needed, that Britain has transitioned from a mainly white country and the years after the Second World War to what it is today: multinational, multiracial, multi-ethnic.
And just to reiterate, Rob, that man is Rishi Sunak. People might remember the name. He was former Chancellor under Boris Johnson. Just tell us what led to Rishi Sunak winning this contest. He was the clear favourite, and his only rival, she just dropped out, did she?
Yes, she withdrew. Her name was Penny Mordaunt. She's a senior government minister. She withdrew at the last minute. So why is it Rishi Sunak? I think because a majority of Conservative MPs decided that what they wanted was sort of stability. They didn't want any more colour and drama. I think they were rather impressed at the fact that Mr Sunak had been finance minister. And if you think about the fact that the UK is in the middle of an economic crisis, it sort of makes sense to them. And you knew there was a but coming. It's very important to remember there are lots of Conservative MPs who do not like Rishi Sunak one bit. Certainly the supporters of Boris Johnson, who believe that Mr Sunak knifed their hero in the back. And if you remember, if people have got memories long enough to think back to the summer leadership contest between Rishi Sunak and the now but soon to be gone Prime Minister Liz Truss, some of her supporters had accused him of being a socialist. I mean, absolutely extraordinary, because he'd been against tax cuts.
So how is he going to bring the party into line, as it were?
I think he's going to have great difficulty, because although most people in the Conservative Party will tell you he's immensely likeable, as they would see it, and sort of urbane and good with other politicians, I think some people might say that the job is just utterly impossible for 3 reasons. One, that the Conservatives have been in power for 12 years, but perhaps more importantly, the second one is that even though he's now got the job, the party is not united behind him. There are plenty of people who don't like him. And then thirdly, it's that the Conservative Party has no no longer united about the place they want their leader to take them to. They're not united in a vision of what post-Brexit Britain should look like. There are all sorts of factions within the governing Conservative Party, and while I think there'll be far less turbulence with him as Prime Minister than if it had been Boris Johnson making a comeback, he still faces an utterly gargantuan task, James.
And Rob, just a quick one on this, for people listening, looking at what's been going on and wondering why, given all this chopping and changing, there hasn't actually been an election. Is that going to happen?
Don't know is the short answer, but to get to the first bit, I know it looks odd, but that's just the kind of constitutional parliamentary democracy we have. It's the party that can form a majority in Parliament that gets to form the government and to choose whoever they want as leader. I think whether there will be an election, so not a constitutional matter but a political matter, I think depends on whether there's an outbreak of pragmatism in the Conservative Party. I mean, ever since 2016, the party's famous pragmatism has gone as they've sort of fought over, what Brexit should mean, what economic policy should be. I mean, I think if there is an outbreak of pragmatism, then possibly the government will sort of steer on to the next election, which needs to be held before January 2025. If not, then there'll be turmoil.
Rob Watson in Westminster. Russia has been accused of a false flag disinformation campaign by suggesting that Ukraine has been planning to use what it called a dirty bomb, conventional explosives laced with radioactive material. It's an unsubstantiated claim and has been rejected by Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky as well as by Western leaders. Yet it was an accusation once again made by Russia's foreign intelligence chief, Sergei Naryshkin. Our Russia editor, Steve Rosenberg, spoke with him about Russia's continued nuclear rhetoric.
In recent months, Western leaders have been concerned by the scale of nuclear sabre-rattling from senior Russian officials, including President Putin. I asked Russia's foreign intelligence chief, would he state categorically that Russia will not use nuclear weapons in Ukraine or engage in other provocative actions, such as exploding a dirty bomb? Sergei Naryshkin didn't answer the question directly. Instead, he denied there'd been any nuclear rhetoric from Russia. That, he said, had come from the West. Mr. Naryshkin repeated the Russian government's recent claim that Ukrainian leaders had plans to explode a dirty nuclear bomb. I pointed out to him that Moscow has provided no evidence to back up this claim. On Sunday, the UK, US and French governments issued a joint statement rejecting what they called Russia's transparently false allegations against Kyiv, adding that the world would see through any attempt to use this allegation as a pretext for escalation.
Steve Rosenberg. Kyiv is concerned that Moscow is planning an escalation as it continues to pull out of the southern city of Kherson, which is the focus of a major Ukrainian counteroffensive. Ukrainian troops are continuing to retake territory there. Our correspondent James Waterhouse has been to some of the recently liberated villages.
We are being taken by the Ukrainian military to recently liberated areas in the southern Kherson region.
The Russians made it as far as this big metal monument of a watermelon. It's the symbol of the Kherson region as it's mostly grown here, and it marks the tide mark of Moscow's advance. In one of the liberated areas, we meet a soldier who wants to be known only by his call sign, Gadfly.
Are you nervous about when it's your turn to go to the front? Everybody's a bit nervous. The villages are razed. There's no place to hide, and you see the tree lines here. Well, there's nowhere to hide, so as long as we don't have the aviation component, it's going to be really difficult.
Ukraine is back in control here, but of what? Each village has been looted and mostly destroyed. In Heleshinivka, we meet Fedir, a small 69-year-old man who spent months thinking he was going to starve to death.
We lived 6 months under explosions and shelling, under occupation. Those Russians said they were liberators. In reality, they started robbing us. They stole a car from me, but that's not why I'm crying. I'm crying because we spent half a year under explosions. It was impossible.
під зривами були, невозможно було.
Dotted across the fields here are Russian missiles that haven't exploded because the ground is softer at this time of year. There are burnt out vehicles and there are Ukrainian armoured vehicles as well making their way through. And towards the south, there are the sounds or the crackles of artillery in groups of 3, tap, 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 as they land, and there is clearly heavy fighting still taking place. The Ukrainians do have momentum here, but it is territory that is being fiercely fought over.
Alyona spent 2 months under occupation before managing to escape. After the Russians were forced out, she returned to find they'd taken almost everything from her home.
We lived here with my husband for 15 years with 3 children. But when we came here after liberation, it was horror, tears, pain, frustration.
To learn more about the occupiers, you just have to look around a bit. There are their supplies, ammunition, ration packs, and rubbish scattered everywhere. This is not the footprint of a disciplined force, instead, one that has been fighting in squalor.
James Waterhouse. When Harvey Weinstein was found guilty of sexual assault and rape in New York in 2020, it was a landmark moment for the Me Too movement. The disgraced Hollywood producer is facing trial again on Monday in Los Angeles on 11 separate charges of abuse. The 70-year-old denies the charges and is still appealing against his earlier conviction and sentence. Weinstein is set to be in court as a film about his original case, called She Said, is released in the coming weeks. Our correspondent Sophie Long reports.
The only way these women are going to go on the record is if they all jump together.
Eventually, they did.
Hi, my name is Jodi Kantor. I'm an investigative reporter for the New York Times.
Now the investigation that led to the bombshell allegations that rocked Hollywood has been immortalised in a film.
I hope that this film will show how much effort and how many people had to be involved in the process of showing the truth.
That's former model Kaya Sikola, who says Weinstein assaulted her when she was 16, speaking at the film's premiere in New York.
Harvey seemed to be untouchable. Like he used to say that he's the sheriff of this town and nobody can do nothing.
And here's Ambra Batalina Gutierrez, who recorded Weinstein's misconduct.
We need to remember. We need to keep talking about this because it's something that happens so much.
Ashley Chu plays Rowena Chu, another of Weinstein's accusers, or silence breakers, as they've become known.
The idea that women are inspiring each other to find bravery and courage in speaking up, I think, is the beginning of a really wonderful change in Hollywood.
This is bigger than Weinstein. This is about the system protecting abusers.
Can you imagine how many Harveys there are out there?
Well, according to recent research by the advocacy group Women in Film, there are still many. They found a staggering 69% of women they spoke to said they're still experiencing sexual harassment at work in the entertainment industry. And there's concern the Me Too movement is losing momentum. But progress has been made. At the Michelle Dana Acting School in Los Angeles, up-and-coming actors told me they do feel safer now. Here's Josephine Heath.
I've had moments where a photographer or a cameraman will come up, why don't you change this, and they'll touch you, or they'll be like, oh, we just changed the script today and actually this scene will take place and you're not wearing a t-shirt. And it's like, that's maybe something that's gotten better just in the last few years, because for scenes like that, you now always have to have a contract, or you have to have an intimacy coordinator on set. That's not even a job that really existed 5 or 10 years ago. And that makes all actors and even the crew so much safer than it used to.
As more women prepare to take to the witness stand, I spoke to one of Weinstein's first accusers, Rosanna Arquette.
My heart is going out to the women for their courage to be able to speak out and do this and have their day in court. It's really important. A lot of people's lives were completely impacted by this in a way that, devastated them.
The Los Angeles trial is likely to be less of a spectacle than what we saw in New York. This is, after all, a sequel to a story the world has already heard. But it is an important opportunity for the women who say they were silenced to be heard, and for the former legendary producer who still protests his innocence to clear his name.
Sophie Long with that report. Still to come in this podcast.
Congestion on the streets of Madrid is hardly unusual, but it normally comes in the four-wheeled rather than four-legged variety.
Sheep flock the streets of Madrid. Now to Uganda, which is trying to contain an outbreak of the Ebola virus, as 9 more cases have been reported in the capital, Kampala. This brings the number of confirmed infections in the city to 14 since an outbreak was declared last month. The virus has infected more than 70 people and 28 have died. Patience Atahare reports from Kampala.
The Health Minister, Dr. Jane Ruth Acheng, said that the new positive cases were contacts of an individual from Kasanda, one of the most affected districts, who recently died at Mulago Hospital in the capital. 7 of the new cases are from one family. The others are a health worker and his wife. The health worker is from a local clinic in an area just outside the city, where he treated one of the now positive cases. There is concern that the outbreak could continue to spread in the capital. It has been over a month since the Sudan strain of Ebola broke out in Uganda's central region in a rural part of Mubende district. Official figures show there are currently 75 positive Ebola cases in the country, 28 of whom have died. These are only confirmed cases and do not include figures for probable cases or deaths.
Patience Atahare. Another deadly disease is threatening Syria, where more than a decade of war has been exacerbated by widespread starvation, decimated infrastructure and the COVID pandemic. Now, cholera is spreading across the north, affecting thousands around Aleppo, Idlib and Al-Hasaka. Stephanie Prentice reports.
At a treatment centre, at least, families can find some respite. One facility just west of Idlib doing its best to fight the infection, which hasn't been seen in Syria since 2009.
This is Hassan, my son. He's sick and has severe vomiting and diarrhoea. I brought him to the centre and they explained to us the seriousness of the illness. My son's blood pressure had dropped considerably and he was very tired. But after a day or two, his condition has improved a lot.
Dozens of people have died so far after contact with contaminated water. Infections are spiking in refugee camps, with neighbouring Lebanon also reporting hundreds of cases as displaced people shelter on its border. The Syrian Health Ministry has promised to supply a vaccine, so far though without providing a source. For now, it seems the burden is on the shoulders of health workers, treating patients while also teaching people how to avoid becoming infected. Since the first patient was treated just over a month ago, an estimated 15,000 cases have been logged and counting, pointing to a race to get this under control before makeshift facilities won't be enough to stem the spread.
Stephanie Prentice. China's economy is still officially growing despite the COVID lockdowns and property market crash. The latest figure of 3.9% is better than most analysts were expecting, but a long way short of the 5.5% the government was hoping for. So what reaction has there been to the figures? A question for our correspondent in Beijing, Stephen McDonnell.
People don't trust the figures. They don't trust that they're accurate, the GDP figures here. In the past, local governments had tampered with them to make their performance look better. Secondly, you just have to look at the response of the Hong Kong markets when those figures came out. They've gone down, so that's not a great vote of confidence in that figure. Thirdly, they were supposed to come out last week. They were delayed because of the Congress. Obviously, this is because they were worried it might embarrass the government to have the Hong Kong markets collapsing while that Congress is being held. But I think it's just part of a much bigger concern here that the new lineup, which was revealed over the weekend, can't tackle these potentially at least can't tackle these significant economic headaches that they face, that the personnel aren't there to do it, and that either way, they're all there because they're Xi loyalists rather than anything else. And the belief is that those people, like I say, they're there not because of their displayed abilities, but because they're loyal to him. And this shows that now, in the upper echelons of power, that is trumping competence. The biggest concern has been the new premier, for example, now Li Qiang. He's supposed to be in charge of the economy. Well, he was looking after the disastrous lockdown in Shanghai, tens of millions of people confined to their homes for months on end, with massive food shortages, and that's the person you're putting in charge of the economy.
Stephen McDonnell in Beijing. Warning shots from both sides have been fired by North and South Korea. The artillery rounds were set off on the west coast of the peninsula after a North Korean merchant ship, not a military vessel, crossed into South Korean waters during the night. So just how serious is the tension between the two Koreas? Our correspondent in Seoul, Jean Mackenzie, started by outlining the South Korean response.
Now, the Navy said that it was sending out warning signs and it fired shots into the water to try and stop the ship from crossing, but it continued anyway. North Korea then, a couple of hours later, responded with what it said were warning shots of its own. You have to remember that these are two countries that are still technically at war, but even so, these incidents do happen, and sometimes they're accidental. What's interesting about this one that happened overnight is that the South Korean Defense Ministry has come out and said today that it thinks that this was intentional. It's called it an incursion, and it's worried that North Korea is or could be using this as a way to sort of build up to future and potentially more serious provocations, because it's coming at a time when tensions on the Korean Peninsula are probably the highest they've been in 5 years.
How significant is this?
Well, the warning shots were fired around about 2 hours apart. So it's not like they were being fired at the same time. It's not like the two sides sort of engaged in crossfire. It's been quite a remarkable month. If you look at North Korea, it has launched a volley of missiles in this time. It's conducted a series of military drills, flying its warplanes right up close to the border with South Korea. It's been firing artillery into the sea. Now, this comes at a period where negotiations between North Korea and the United States and its allies have been stalled. So North Korea has continued building up its nuclear weapons, continuing with its nuclear program. And really how South Korea and the US have responded to that is by bolstering their defense of the Korean Peninsula. So we've seen in the last couple of months them holding these large-scale military exercises, which we know that North Korea really hates because it sees them as its enemies preparing for war. And so all along, Kim Jong-un has been sort of justifying this recent tension on being a response, really. But the fear underneath all of this is that we are building to something that is going to be more serious and more significant. One of the options, of course, that the intelligence is signalling is that North Korea could be about to test its first nuclear weapon in 5 years.
Is anyone really expecting this to turn into a war, or is it just posturing?
Look, these cycles of tension on the Korean Peninsula, they come and they go, and we're used to them, and many people will tell you they've seen it all before. I think what we have to pay attention to in all this is that North Korea is becoming more dangerous. We have a situation where North Korea is improving its capabilities, and therefore that can play out in the long run. And still we have a situation where at some point North Korea has to come back to the negotiating table, or certainly, the US and South Korea are being urged to try and get it back to the negotiating table to convince the North Koreans to abandon their nuclear program. And the more progress they make, the harder that task is going to be.
Jean Mackenzie in Seoul. For many of us, enthusiasm isn't always easy to come by at the start of a new working week, but could forcing a smile actually make you feel happier? The connection has long been explored by scientists, but now researchers have recruited thousands of people from all over the world to put the hypothesis to the test. Nicholas Coles, a research scientist at Stanford University, was behind the study and explained the findings to Rudy Clubby.
Put simply, the facial feedback hypothesis refers to the idea that posing facial expressions of emotion can directly impact our mood. And we were able to test this idea by having participants around the world pose facial expressions, either neutral facial expressions or happy facial expressions. And after they would pose each one of those expressions, we'd ask them a simple question: how are you feeling right now? And across those 19 countries, we found remarkably reliable evidence that people felt happier after they posed those smiles.
Even if the smile is fake, are we talking about a real smile that reaches your eyes and lights you up, or even a fake one?
So all of these smiles were definitely fake. Some of them were more intense than others. But yes, all of them were fake. And even those fake smiles were able to increase mood by a little bit.
Do we know why that happens then?
We don't quite know why. One popular idea is that the smile serves as a signal that the rest of your body tries to catch up to. And so by smiling, the rest of your body will try to reenact the sensation of happiness and create that full-blown bodily response. But we actually don't quite yet know. So there'll be some future research trying to figure that one out.
I wonder, though, if after giving a fake smile, if that automatically leads to a real smile shortly thereafter.
That's a possibility. We did see that happen for some people, yes.
Mm-hmm. So how exactly were you able to test your subjects? How were you able to prompt that fake smile from them?
We used a couple of different tasks. In one of them, we would have them mimic photos of actors who were displaying highly realistic expressions of happiness. And so by mimicking those photos, participants were posing essentially very intense smiles. And those intense smiles led to increases in happiness. For other participants, we would ask them to move the muscles in their face and pull their lips back towards their ears just using the muscles in their face. And if your listeners try that themselves, they'll notice that this creates a bit of a less intense half smile, almost a polite smile. And even that led to an increase in happiness. And so those are the two main tasks that seem to work in our study.
Scientist Nicholas Coles from Stanford University. The narrow, cobbled streets of Spain's capital, Madrid, have been overwhelmed, not with tourists, but with a sea of sheep. They're part of an ancient herding route for shepherds taking their flocks south for winter grazing. Tim Allman reports.
Congestion on the streets of Madrid is hardly unusual, but it normally comes in the four-wheeled rather than four-legged variety. Hundreds of sheep and goats bringing the Spanish capital to a standstill.
I thought it was such a wonderful experience. I thought it was crazy that there were so many sheep. I've never seen anything like it.
It's unique to see that many sheep in central Madrid. I was talking with tourists from New York, and they said that this is unique in the world.
The shepherds herd their flocks through ancient routes from the north of the country down to warmer climes in the south. Centuries ago, this would be quiet countryside. Now, it's a teeming metropolis.
We vindicate the use of royal cattle tracks because they're the legacy of Spanish farmers. We have the right to walk through the vast net of tracks that link the north with the south, east and west.
By tradition, a small fee is paid for every 1,000 sheep as part of an agreement that dates back to the 15th century. It is a journey of more than 1,000 kilometres. Uphill, down dale, and occasionally across tarmac.
Tim Allman and some sheep in Madrid. And that's all from us for now, but there'll be a new edition of the Global News podcast later. If you want to comment on this podcast or the topics covered in it, you can send us an email. The address is globalpodcast@bbc.co.uk. You can also find us on Twitter @GlobalNewsPod. This edition was mixed by Emma Crow, and the producer was Eleanor Sly. The editor is Karen Martin. I'm Alex Ritson. Until next time, goodbye.